Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K, and we're talking about when, well, first of all, we're talking about Canada at war, but more specifically, we're talking about what happened when the first reports came back from the front.
Yeah, and I think I was saying that at first there's this incredible excitement, and of course by 1916 you've already gone through Ypres, and you've already kind of had to deal with the Somme, so of course recruitment starts to drop off. Well, actually starts to drop off at the very beginning of 1916, and the government's first response is to change the regulations a little. Regulations, yeah, and so of course every country but Britain and the US and Canada had conscription before 1914, and Britain and Canada are going to be forced to introduce it as the Allied situation becomes critical. So what is it that the government initially does? What's their first response? Well, I find it amusing. It's probably not the slightest bit funny at all, but I've always been charmed by it. First thing they did was they lowered the height of the volunteer enlistment. So if you were shorter, now you could get in. So for the medical, they decreased the chest measurements so that a 5'2" man with a 33-inch chest could sign up and go off and fight. Why shouldn't little people get to fight? You know, so you actually have, you actually, that's okay for you to say you're 6'2", aren't you? Or 6 or something.
Thereabouts,
yeah, around there. So you actually have pee-wee battalions, so battalions of much, much shorter people who are, and of course people were rude and said, well, you know, all the people out west in the prairies, they're all big strapping lads, right? All firemen. So that will give French Canadians a chance to sign up. So just, cruel, nasty. Get my fiddle out for that. So you have a Bantam battalion, pee-wee battalions, and also there was another requirement that married men had to get their wife's written approval before they raced off to the exciting war, and of course that's dropped as well. So now you could actually, because you have to worry about what will happen to the family when you're gone, right? And the government came under fire for not doing enough. But it's hard to get people to go off to face the possibility of dying unless they have a really good reason for it. And then, as I mentioned before, on January 1st, 1916, Prime Minister Borden went on a little field trip to the Western Front to visit the Canadian troops, and that's when he decided that they should increase the Canadian contribution to 500,000. So comes back, realises that recruitment isn't really picking up, and by July of 1916 he set up a National Services Board, which is just a kind of forerunner to, it's just how you find out how many people you've got that might be available to be soldiers. So anybody that was anyone that was a man, 18 to about 45, got registration cards so that government knew how many men there was, you know, in this kind of pool that were of military age. And so there were 1.3 million men registered, and of those only about 475,000 were available for active duty. But you know, that would have been enough to make that commitment that possible that they'd already made. Now I found this really cool little thing, and of course somebody else found it before me. It's a document, G-Star, the 123rd Battalion recruiting leaflet. And this again, it's an attempt to try and get men to sign up and go off and fight. And so it's really good, and it's directed to the women of Canada. And so I think it's, you know, really wonderful. And so it says, to the women of Canada, in addressing these few remarks exclusively to the women of the country, it's to be understood that we've arrived at that period in the struggle where we realise the utter futility of recruiting meetings. So they're just not getting anybody to show up for those. The men who have as yet failed to join the colours will not be influenced by any eloquence from any platform. So he's saying, like, we can't get them to. It's up to you, women of Canada, to get it done now. And so he just goes back to say, you know, the 1st Division of the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, we swept up the young manhood of the country in the first enthusiasm. We secured the cream of the country in the men who flocked to the colours, yada yada. As the second call, men were stopping to calculate and hesitate. And since then, the hesitation has developed into stagnation. Men who see a desperate winter ahead are joining the colours and few others. The remainder are deadwood. That's nice. And then he says, why? Because there's the man who prefers to allow others to fight for him so that he can pursue a comfortable occupation. So you can start to see the pressure that's been put on people. You're young, you're healthy, you're fit. Why are you still here? Why aren't you off fighting? And then he says that the second one is the man who is influenced by the selfish maternal appeal either from his wife or his mother. So his mom going, go and hide, son. They're coming round. You don't want you to be sent, or the wife saying, oh, don't go. So now the blame shifting. So there's like some men that just want an easy life, and then there's the other ones that listen to their mums and their wives and won't go. So we can't get recruits because of that. And then he says, the third reason is the man who claims his business would go to pieces without him. And the fourth are the others, call them what you may. Ooh, nasty. So, and then he says, my appeal to women. And so it's really crazy. He says, you entertain these wretched apologies in your home. You accept their theatre tickets, their flowers and their cars. You go with them to watch the troops parade. You foully wrong their manhood by encouraging them to perform their parlour tricks while Europe is burning up. So you're just like, kind of living off them, really. You're like, okay, one more box of chocolates. I'm not going to send you to the war. And so he says to them, bar them from your homes, refuse their invitations, scorn their attentions. For the love of heaven, if they won't be men, then you be women. Tell them to come in uniform, no matter how bad. Bar out the able-bodied man who has no obligations. Show that you despise him. Make your son, your husband, your lover. Oh, I'm surprised they'd mention that. Your brother. Join now while he retains the remnants of honour. Compulsory training is in the offing. Get the apologists, the weaklings, the mother's pets into the service. Weed out all, and we will find out who are the cowards. Analyse your friends, you women. Refuse their attentions and tell them why. Make them wake up. So that's a pretty straightforward shooting from the hip kind of get those men out of there. So and men were also asked to sign up for home defence duty. So if you were too old or kind of not in that pool, you could help defend Canada at home, which probably wouldn't have been all that tough because we weren't under direct attack yet or ever.
So what was the attitude of French Canadians to the war and to conscription?
We've mentioned this, I think, before. French Canadians believed, and fair enough, they weren't imperialists as Anglo-Canadians were, and they didn't really have much connection to France, didn't really have much connection to Europe at all, and hadn't really since the French Revolution, because Quebec was still more or less a Roman Catholic province or state or little nation, if you want to be really nice, and so they didn't like the secularism of France and the anti-clerical attacks and things like that. So the French Canadians were never as keen to go off and fight, and they'd shown that already. That this had become a kind of sore point during the Boer War. That Anglo-Canadians were like, oh, where's the fight? Just point me in the right direction, and I'll go off and volunteer. And French Canadians were like, I don't really think we should be involved in this at all. These poor Boer farmers, they're just like we were after the conquest. We sympathise more with them. And of course, one of their spokesmen is the now by this time the nationalist Henri Bourassa. And Bourassa had been an MP, he'd been in the Liberal Party, he'd become an independent, fiercely nationalistic, and he believed that this would be a step back into colonialism if Canada, and really, to be fair to him, he doesn't say that French Canadians shouldn't go off and fight in the war. He says none of it. He's like, really, this has nothing to do with us. Stay out of it. We can support the Allies, and we can support them better by our economic contribution. We're a huge country. He even has like this really good economic plan. He says, take all the wasteland outside the major cities, turn them into farms, take all those unemployed men, make the Hudson Bay Company give up some of that land that it has out west. give them to these men, turn them into farmers, increase the production by leaps and bounds, and send that over in your little Atlantic convoys. You know, help them that way. And to be fair to him, Canada does do a lot of that. You know, it provides munitions, and it provides wheat, and it provides bacon. Single out bacon, because that's produced in Quebec and in Ontario, mixed farming. So so the idea is that, you know, French Canadian kind of opposed to war in theory. They're opposed to going in theory, and in practice it's even harder for them because of people like Sam Hughes, because Sam Hughes has, he antagonized them by not creating separate French-Canadian regiments. So you have the Vendus, the 22nd at Montreal, and that's really the only one. If you were French-Canadian, you were, and you wanted to sign up, you wanted to volunteer, you were just sent to any unit, so you were just dispersed amongst the Anglo units. Because you're probably not bilingual, you couldn't rise through the ranks, so they don't have really the same amount of officers that Anglo-Canadians would have had. And since the 1880s, in our militias, it's probably okay in the 1880s, but by the 1890s, our militia business had kind of turned almost all Anglo, and so they had never really been welcomed into the militia, so they're not there in much force. And then they've got this kind of theoretical reason for not going. And then qualified French-Canadian officers were overlooked at promotion time. That doesn't help. But probably the worst thing is that he uses Protestant ministers to recruit in French-Canadian villages. And French Canadians mostly Roman Catholic at that point, so that wouldn't go down very well at all. And during the conscription debates, when it comes to that, Barras says, like, absolutely. Well, at first, I think in 1915, he says maybe there should be selective conscription, and then when it actually comes up, French Canadians, of course, not happy about it. But other people were unhappy as well. The Trades and Labour Congress, they weren't happy about it. So it's not as simple as it's been portrayed, I think, in the past. So French Canadian ministers said that the people of Quebec would defend North America from attack, but that conscription wouldn't be necessary unless German U-boats sailed up the St. Lawrence, docked at Quebec, and started knocking on people's doors. Then we'd fight back. So so it's difficult, because people are like, this is just another example. You don't think the same way that we think, and you're not like us, and so it just gets downright naughty. The conscription debates, when they take place, they don't take place in the House of Commons, because the House of Commons actually burned down on February the 3rd, 1916. So they take place in the Victoria Museum by Queensway. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's quite interesting, the burning of Parliament buildings. Because whenever something like that happens during wartime, people are always like, it must be the enemy. The Huns must have infiltrated Canada, landed in Quebec, not knocked on any doors, taken a train all the way to Ottawa, found the biggest building, thought this must be Parliament building, and then did something really nasty to it, so we've been infiltrated. So there's this little thing from our national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, about this little thing called social studies, just to always be at the back of the paper, Parliament burns, and so it's just talking about several lost lives. And the Globe's morning headlines were, "The most picturesque public building in North America is a shapeless ruin, several lives lost, fire believed to be the work of the enemy, dramatic ending of common sitting." So it's like, and it's like the fire starts just before 9 at night. There's not many people at the session, but somebody, I'm saying this is when somebody runs into the chamber and shouts fire, and it's a big one. Like, if it was a little one, you'd just be like, well, okay, so why even bother telling me? Don't even bother. So a wall of smoke rolls into the room, and within about 15 minutes they'd managed to evacuate, or they thought they'd evacuated almost everybody, but 7 people died. One of them was a Nova Scotia parliamentarian who was in a phone booth, probably changing into a Superman costume, didn't know about the fire, and so he gets caught in it. Another was a guy, clerk, an assistant clerk of the House, who refused to slide down a rope halfway to safety, even though he was assured that he would probably only break a leg. But he decided not to slide down, so he burned in it as well. And then there were these 2 chicks who were the guests of the speaker's wife, and they decided to go back and rescue their furs. and they burned up with their fires. The smell of singed beaver pelt probably wasn't very nice. And then a couple of guys who were in rescuing people, a floor collapsed on them, and so they were stuck. But the funny part of this is, it says that, so Parliament moved into Victoria Museum, the Commons was quartered in the lecture hall, the Senate was accommodated in the apartment set aside for fossils and extinct leviathans, which has not escaped the notice of certain humourists, so it's like the dinosaur room, and that's where the old guys went. So it was wartime, and some people thought the fire was the incendiary work of the Hun. Parliament Hill was soon guarded by 1,200 soldiers. The troops protecting the finance department had bullets in their rifles. So it's like nobody else actually got any protection. They're like, yeah, come any closer and I'll probably shoot, but there's nothing in my gun. But any place with money and important stuff, they had bullets. And then Ottawa's fire chief said, and I quote, "I distinctly heard 5 explosions." And he says a major of the engineer was with me who said, "Those are certainly shells." So they thought that it was German shells. But Sir Percy Sherwood, chief of Dominion Police, told reporters that as far as he could see, the fire started when a careless smoker dropped a match or a cigar in the building's reading room, and that was what transformed the place into an inferno within 3 minutes. But nonetheless, Sir Percy's force sprang into action and cast a dragnet. At Windsor the next day, a 28-year-old who gave his name as Charles Stroney was arrested and removed from the Ottawa train heading for Detroit. He protested his innocence in a decided foreign accent, claiming that he was just a musician and a Belgian, which his passport seemed to bear out. The police said that there would be more arrests in the future, and of course there are none because it's just a little smoking problem. So it's kind of crazy. But yeah, so French Canadians and there are conscription riots in Montreal. Newspapers that supported conscription had their windows broken, and there's another conscription riot actually in 1918 in Easter, I think, at Quebec City. So really, but in a sense, introducing conscription stopped all the finger pointing between French and English Canada, because everybody had an equal chance of being called up. So now you couldn't really say, well, yeah.
Well, that about wraps it up for this part of this episode.
Oh, for heaven's sake!
Yeah, join us again for part 3.
Okay.